They gave me a collared pet alien as a reward, but I freed it before everyone and it hugged me, the sons of Havers. Reach beat down like judgment, carving every shadow sharp, scouring every exposed inch of skin, but the weight pressing on Rodney's shoulders had nothing to do with the heat. It came from the choice he was about to make, the kind that branded a man forever. He stood stiff and silent in the cracked plaza, dust swirling around his boots. The colony officials pining on their makeshift platform, they wore polished metals over sweat-stained uniforms, pretending their authority mattered in a place so close to the edge of nowhere. Rodney didn't bother looking at them. He kept his steel gray eyes on the ground, jaw tight, body still, waiting. Commander Bren Axton stepped forward, his voice slicing through the oppressive air like a blade. For your service during the new bridge evacuation, he said, and your continued loyalty to the survival of Havers Reach, you are hereby recognized. Rodney tasted the bitterness rising in his throat. Recognition, a word as empty as the fields around this dying settlement. He hadn't saved lives for medals or ceremony, he had done it because he couldn't watch innocent people burn alive while cowards debated logistics, and as a token of our gratitude, Axton continued, gesturing sharply, we offer you something rare, a symbol of the future we are building here. The soldiers dragged it forward. An enclosure made of thick cracked glass mounted on a wheeled platform. Inside it crouched a figure so still Rodney almost thought she was a statue. Then she shifted and the light caught her. Her skin was an otherworldly blue, delicate but marred with grime and bruises. Long strands of tangled green hair fell over her face, hiding most of her features. Except for one thing, her eyes. They were enormous, luminous violet, and filled with a quiet, exhausted terror. A heavy iron collar bit into the slim line of her throat, attached to a dangling chain that clinked against the metal floor as she trembled. Rodney's gut twisted. He had seen cages like this before, years ago in the outer colonies after the Syndicate Wars. He knew exactly what it meant when a living being was offered up like property. He wanted to look away, to pretend he hadn't seen, but that wasn't who he was. Not anymore. This is Valari stock, Axton said, smiling with the cold satisfaction of a man who thought he owned everything he saw untouched, perfect for companionship or labor. She's yours now. The murmurs of the crowd buzzed in Rodney's ears like flies, some approving, some disgusted, most indifferent. The girl didn't cry out, she didn't plead, she simply pressed her forehead to the floor of the enclosure, hands curled around a worn crystal pendant that hung from her neck, a small battered thing that still caught the light with a faint shimmer. A piece of home, maybe a piece of something she refused to let them take. Rodney's hands curled into fists at his sides. This wasn't mercy, it was a mockery. He moved without thinking, stepping forward so fast that the guards barely reacted in time. One barked a warning, another reached for his weapon. Rodney ignored them all. At the front of the enclosure, he jammed the blade of his utility knife into the rusted lock. Metal shrieked in protest. With a grunt and a savage twist, he snapped the mechanism. The door swung open. The girl flinched, shrinking back. Her fingers clutched the pendant tighter. Dust and silence filled the space between them. Rodney expected her to run, to bolt into the streets, to disappear into the waste beyond the colony walls. Instead, she hesitated just for a heartbeat, then pushed herself to her feet with trembling legs and staggered toward him. The crowd gasped. Rodney barely had time to open his arms before she collided with him, burying her face against his chest. She was weightless, bones wrapped in bruised flesh, her arms wrapped around his waist with desperate strength, as if he was the last solid thing left in a crumbling world. The soldier shifted, uncertain. Axton's face darkened, lips pulling back from his teeth in a silent snarl. Rodney lifted his gaze to meet Axton's without a word. He wasn't letting her go, not now, not ever. The girl trembled against him, her breath coming in shallow gasps. He could feel her heartbeat, rapid and unsteady, through the thin fabric of her ragged clothes. Axton took a step forward, fingers drifting toward the holster at his side. Step away, Vance, he said, voice low and dangerous. Now. Rodney didn't move. You'll bring ruin down on yourself, Axton warned, on all of us. Rodney's voice, when it came, was steady and quiet. Then you should have thought about that before you chained a living being like a dog. A ripple went through the onlookers. Some drew back, some watched with grim fascination. A few too few looked away in shame. The girl clung tighter, her fingers twisting into the worn leather of Rodney's jacket. He rested one calloused hand gently on her back, feeling every flinch, every shudder she couldn't hide. Axton's eyes narrowed into slits. You're making a mistake, he said. Rodney shrugged. I can live with it. Weapons shifted in the soldiers' hands. Rodney knew he couldn't fight them all, knew that if one trigger finger slipped, he and the girl would be dead before they hit the ground. Still he stood his ground, the dry wind tugging at his jacket, the sun's hammering down, the whole world holding its breath. Finally Axton spat into the dust at his feet. Get him out of my sight. Rodney didn't wait For the guards to reconsider, he turned, keeping his body between the girl and the soldiers, and walked. He didn't look back. Behind him the colony square buzzed with furious whispers. The girl stumbled, and he tightened his grip around her shoulders, steadying her. Without a word they moved fast, slipping through alleys where the buildings leaned drunkenly against each other, past rusting market stalls and silent machines. Every step away from the plaza felt like a countdown. Rodney's mule waited, hidden by the old riverbed, a battered desert runner patched together with more stubbornness than engineering. It wasn't much, but it would get them clear. He helped the girl into the passenger seat, strapping her in as gently as he could. She said nothing, just clutched her crystal pendant to her chest and watched him with those wide, exhausted eyes. Rodney climbed behind the controls. The engine coughed, growled, and caught. He floored it. The colony disappeared behind them in a cloud of dust. Rodney didn't know where they were going, yet didn't know how long they had before Axton changed his mind and sent hunters after them. All he knew was that he was done standing by while monsters wore human faces beside him. The girl closed her eyes and leaned her head against the window, her whole body sagging in relief. It would take time to undo the damage they'd done to her. Maybe it would never fully heal, but for now she was free, and for the first time in too long so was he. The waste swallowed them whole. Dust curled in lazy spirals across the cracked ground as Rodney drove the mule farther from Havers' reach, the sun shrinking to a smoldering bruise behind them. The colony blurred into the distance, its jagged rooftops dissolving into the shimmer of heat waves in the passenger seat. The girl sat rigid and silent, both hands clutching the battered crystal pendant against her chest, her green hair tangled and dull curtained her face. Only the faint rhythmic tremble of her shoulders betrayed that she hadn't yet let herself breathe. Rodney kept one hand loose on the controls, the other resting near the small caliber pistol stashed under the dashboard. He didn't expect Axton to let this stand by morning. If not sooner, they'd send patrols, maybe even hunters. He needed distance and shelter. Glancing sideways, Rodney took in Sierra's posture, the way she curled in on herself, trying to vanish into the cracked upholstery. The chain from her collar lay twisted in her lap, an ugly rusted thing that caught the fading light like a brand. The sight turned his stomach. They crossed the broken remains of an old cargo road, little more than fractured slabs now, and dipped into a shallow ravine framed by crumbling rock faces. Here between the folds of the land they might hide for a night, maybe longer if luck held. Rodney throttled down and eased the mule behind a tangle of boulders, switching off the engine. The sudden silence roared in his ears. He climbed out first, sweeping the area with sharp eyes. No movement, no glint of lenses in the distance, only the endless whispering wind. Then he circled back and opened the passenger door. Sierra flinched at the sound. Her hands jerked toward her pendant again, as if expecting a blow. Rodney crouched low, hands open, voice low and careful. Hey, it's okay, we're safe here for now. For a moment she didn't move, then slowly she unfolded from the seat, her movements stiff and mechanical. When she stood, Rodney saw again how fragile she looked. Small starved bruises blooming along her arms like old stains, and still somehow there was a grace to her, something that hadn't been beaten out of her yet. He motioned toward a patch of flat ground tucked against the rocks. We'll camp here tonight, I'll get a fire going. She only nodded, clutching the pendant so tightly her knuckles went white. Rodney busied himself with the essentials, pitching a small thermal tarp between two boulders for shelter, gathering dry scrub for a fire, checking the mule supply rack. Supplies were low. Water would be a problem if they couldn't find a spring in the next few days, but tonight survival came second to something else. As the fire crackled to life, small and carefully shielded from view, Rodney sat back on his heels and looked over at Sierra. She was sitting stiffly near the rocks, legs tucked up, arms wrapped around herself. The chain from her collar glinted dully in the firelight. Rodney's chest tightened. He moved slowly, deliberately, pulling a battered multi-tool from his belt. He held it out, not toward her but where she could see it. Feel the choice, I can take that off, he said quietly, if you want. Sarah stared at him, unmoving. Her fingers crept to the collar without conscious thought, touching it like a wound. Minutes stretched out. Rodney didn't rush her. He stayed where he was, letting the fire's warmth crawl over his back, letting her weigh whatever ancient fears this decision stirred in her blood. Finally, with a tremor that went from her shoulders to her hands, she nodded, not a big nod, just enough. Rodney rose, moving carefully as if approaching a wounded animal. He knelt beside her, the firelight throwing long shadows across the dust. The collar was cruder up close than he expected, scored with old scratches lined with tiny ancient filth. A thing meant to be worn, not removed. A lock built into the side, mechanical. Heavy. He set to work. The girl held perfectly still except for the way her breath hitched whenever metal scraped against metal. Rodney worked methodically, murmuring to himself in that same low, steady tone he'd once used, calming trapped miners. There we go, almost got it. The multi-tools saw wind softly, a few tense moments, a faint metallic snap, and the collar clattered into the dirt. Sarah flinched as if struck. Rodney pulled back. Immediately, hands raised. "It's off, you're free. No one's going to put that thing back on you." She stared at the broken collar lying in the dust. Slowly, mechanically, she reached up with trembling hands and touched her own bare neck as if unsure it was real. Her fingers brushed the skin, red and raw, where the metal had chafed, and she gasped a soft broken sound. More feeling than voice. Rodney felt something twist in his gut, not pity, not just anger. Something older, something heavier. Sierra bent forward, suddenly wrapping her arms around her knees, hiding her face. Her shoulders shook in silent spasms. No sound escaped her, but the violence of the emotion she fought was raw enough to vibrate the air. Rodney looked away, giving her the dignity of privacy. He fed another scrap of wood into the fire, kept his hands busy, made no move to comfort unless she asked. When he finally glanced back, she had lifted her head. Her face was wet, but her eyes were clear, and they were watching him. No hatred, no suspicion. Something else, something brittle and painful and terrifying. Hope. Rodney cleared his throat, rough with dust and too many unsaid things. He pulled 2 ration packs from his bag and tossed one toward her feet. "Not much," he said, "but it's food, better warm." She reached out with hesitant fingers, drawing the packet closer. Rodney demonstrated first how to crack the chemical heater, how to knead the pack until it steamed. He made a mess of it, exaggerating his clumsiness a little, and was rewarded with the ghost of a smile flickering across her lips. Small victory. Sarah mimicked him, fumbling at first, then managing it. The smell of synthetic stew filled the air, unappetizing but rich after days of starvation. Rodney ate in silence, keeping his distance, letting her pace herself. She ate slowly at first, then faster, until she had to stop herself from choking. It was a brutal thing to witness, how the body betrayed its own desperation. When she finished, she set the empty packet carefully beside the fire, her movements deliberate. Rodney leaned back against a rock, arms crossed. "You're stronger than you think," he said quietly, not a compliment, a statement of fact. Sarah looked at him for a long time, the flames dancing in her violet eyes. Then she nodded once. Sharp, decisive. A new silence fell, not heavy, not hostile, companionable. Above them the stars clawed their way through the darkening sky, fierce and cold. Tomorrow they would move again, find better shelter, plan for the inevitable pursuit. But tonight they had a fire and freedom, and the first fragile thread of something that might one day be called trust. Rodney woke before the first blush of sunrise, every instinct prickling in warning. The fire had burned low to a bed of glowing embers, casting long, flickering shadows across the ravine. The night air was sharp, carrying the dry scent of dust and stone. For a moment he lay still, listening. The mule creaked softly as it settled against the cold. Somewhere far off, a bird-like call echoed once, then fell silent. But it wasn't the sounds that woke him, it was the feeling, an old familiar pressure at the base of his skull, honed over years of surviving places like this. They weren't alone anymore. He sat up without a sound, reaching for the pistol tucked just inside his jacket. Beside him, under the shelter of the thermal tarp, Sarah slept curled on her side, the crystal pendant cradled against her chest, her green hair fanned around her like a veil. Even in sleep her brow was furrowed, her body tense as if some part of her could never fully relax. Rodney touched her shoulder gently, her eyes snapped open wide and alert. He pressed a finger to his lips, signaling silence. She stiffened, but nodded, understanding. Moving quickly, he doused the fire with a handful of dust, smothering the last of the embers. He slung the small emergency pack over his shoulder and gestured for her to follow. They slipped into the rocks without speaking, boots crunching softly against the brittle ground. The ravines' walls twisted ahead, offering narrow paths and hiding spots. Rodney led them through a jagged cut in the stone, his steps silent, his body low to the ground. He didn't head for the mule, too exposed. If Axton's hunters were already out there, and Rodney would bet his last bullet they were, the vehicle would be the first thing they watched. They needed to disappear behind them. Faint now, but growing louder, came the unmistakable thrum of engine noise. Rodney swore under his breath. Not just a scout team they'd sent, bikes, fast, light, designed for rough terrain. They were sweeping the area. Sarah kept close, moving quickly despite her bare, battered feet. She clutched the emergency pack strapped tightly with one hand, the crystal pendant bouncing lightly against her throat with every step. She didn't slow, didn't stumble. She was tougher than she looked. Rodney ducked into a narrow fissure between 2 leaning rock slabs and pulled her in after him. They pressed back into the shadows just as a pair of scout bikes zipped past the mouth of the ravine, kicking up rooster tails of dust and gravel. He waited, counting heartbeats. One bike circled lazily, its rider scanning the rocks with a handheld thermal scanner. Rodney tensed, feeling Sir's breath hitch beside him. He could hear The faint electronic whine as the scanner swept their way. The boulder at their back still radiated stored heat from the day's sun, maybe enough to blur their signatures. Maybe. The rider slowed the engine, rumbling low. Rodney's grip on the pistol tightened. He could take the shot if he had to, but it would blow their cover and they wouldn't outrun the rest. He glanced at Sir. She was staring straight ahead, jaw clenched, hands fisted. At her side, seconds dragged out like hours. Finally the scanner beeped faintly, and the rider throttled up, moving on. Rodney let out a slow breath, not relief, just recalculating. They weren't safe, not by a long shot. When the noise faded enough to be sure, he tugged Sierra gently forward. They stayed low, weaving through the rocks, moving steadily east toward the broken plateau. Rodney remembered from old survey maps, if they could reach the caves near the cliffs, they might have a shot at losing their pursuers entirely, but it wouldn't be easy. By the time the sun cleared the horizon, painting the rocks in blood and gold, they had put nearly 3 miles between themselves and the ravine. Rodney finally allowed them to rest in a deep hollow beneath an overhang, half hidden by tangled scrub. He sank to one knee, scanning the surrounding ridges. No movement yet. Sierra collapsed beside him, her face pale and drawn, her body shivering despite the rising heat. Rodney dug a water pack from the emergency kit and handed it over. Drink slow, he murmured. You're doing good, she obeyed, taking small careful sips. Her hands shook so badly she nearly spilled it. Rodney steadied the pouch for her without comment. When she finished, she wiped her mouth with the back of her hand and looked at him, really, looked for the first time since they'd fled the colony. There was a question in her eyes. Why risk everything for her? Rodney leaned back against the cool stone, letting the silence stretch. He wasn't good at speeches, he wasn't good at a lot of things, but he would the truth. Back when I was with the evac teams, he said, voice low, I pulled a family out of a collapsed habdome. They had a kid, Valari too, must have been about your age. Sarah's fingers tightened around the pendant. I got them clear, Rodney continued. Thought I saved them, but when we made it back to base command, he exhaled a sharp, bitter sound. They took the kid, put a collar on her, sold her off like livestock. He looked down at his hands, flexing them once before letting them fall. Still I stood there. I didn't stop them. Told myself it wasn't my fight, that I'd done enough just getting them out alive. His mouth twisted into something that wasn't quite a smile. I swore I wouldn't make that mistake again. Sarah's gaze didn't waver. She watched him with a gravity far older than her face. Then slowly she reached out and brushed her fingers against the back of his hand. Not much, just a touch, but it was enough. Rodney squeezed his eyes shut for a heartbeat, grounding himself. When he opened them, the horizon was already sharpening with the rising heat, the rocks throwing long jagged shadows. We need to move, he said. Sir nodded, no hesitation this time. Rodney stood scanning the cliffs ahead. The caves weren't far now. If they could reach them, if they could disappear long enough, maybe, just maybe, they'd survive. As they set off again, a low familiar whine drifted down the wind engines. Closer this time. Rodney tightened his grip on the emergency pack and picked up the pace. He didn't know how many would come. He didn't know how long they could keep running, but he knew this much: he wasn't leaving her behind, not ever again. The caves rose from the desert like the broken teeth of some ancient beast, jagged and dark against the bleeding sky. Rodney pushed onward, his muscles aching from the climb, every breath a dry scrape in his throat. The wind picked up, swirling dust around them in furious little eddies, but he didn't stop. Sir stayed close behind him, silent but steady, her steps light and deliberate. By the time they reached the shelter of the largest cave mouth, the sun had slipped below the horizon, leaving behind a bruised, sullen twilight. Rodney ducked inside, first pistol drawn, sweeping the space with quick, efficient movements, empty, dry, deep enough to hide them at least for a night. He lowered his weapon and turned back to Sir, who stood just outside the threshold, her violet eyes wide and weary. It's safe, he said, voice from dust and exhaustion for now. Sierra hesitated for a beat, then crossed the threshold, the crystal pendant she wore catching the last lingering threads of light. Rodney dropped the emergency pack and set about building a small fire from dried brush he collected along the way. He worked by habit, every movement stripped down to necessity: shelter, warmth, rest, the basics. As the fire cracked and spat in the darkness, Rodney sat back on his heels and studied her. Sarah knelt across from him, the firelight painting her features in shades of gold and shadow. She was watching him too, as if weighing something unseen. Finally she spoke, her voice soft and musical, the words, careful, you saved me. Rodney shook his head once. Not enough yet. Sir's fingers tightened around her pendant. She glanced at the dark mouth of the cave beyond the firelight, then back to him. I was taken from Ezler, she said, her accent giving a gentle lilt to the name, my home city, during the fall. Rodney